Welcome to the 2025 Robert J. Schwartz Memorial Lecture, brought to you by the Windward Institute, a division of the Windward School. The Windward Institute provides a range of offerings and resources to advance its mission of increasing childhood literacy rates. To learn more about the Institute, visit our website.
Good evening. Welcome. I'm Alexis Pokna, the director of the Windward Institute, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 2025 Robert J. Schwartz Memorial Lecture. Each fall and spring, the Windward School and Institute invite esteemed researchers to present on a topic relevant to the school's mission in order to inform our community, to bridge research and practice, and to promote meaningful change in reading education. Active engagement in the most current research informs everything that we do at the Windward Institute, from offering free resources such as community reading screenings, the Read podcast, the Beacon Journal, webinars for teachers, parents, and community members, and our monthly blog, to providing the highest quality professional development through workshops, courses, and on-site training in schools. We are proud to partner with a number of organizations, as well as a dedicated 15-member advisory board to help advance the application of educational research and expand access to high-quality instruction and interventions for all students. The Windward Institute and its programs are made possible by the time, talents, and generosity of many of you here in our audience and live streaming with us tonight. And for that, we are incredibly grateful. Thank you so much for your continued support. With that, please join me in welcoming Jamie Williamson, Head of School and Executive Director of the Windward Institute, who will lead you through tonight's program.
Thank you so much, Alexis. I so appreciate it. So good to see everybody here tonight. We actually have about 800 folks joining us, both here and on live stream. So it's a very, very exciting evening. And I'd like to start off by saying thank you to everyone in this room, because as educators, as advocates, and as partners in this critical work, I'm so grateful for your presence here tonight. I actually have the great pleasure of presenting this year's recipient of the John J. Russell Award for Advocacy in Education. This award, honoring our former head of school, Dr. Russell, who's with us tonight, is given annually to those who've made an impact in helping children with learning disabilities reach their full potential. Award recipients' efforts may be in the field of research, pedagogy, legislation, education, and business. And I'm honored to present this year's award to New York State Assemblymember Joanne Simon. Assemblymember Simon, we can give a round of applause for her. I so appreciate that. And we'll have you give another one in just a little bit. But Assemblymember Simon has dedicated her life's work to protecting the rights of those with disabilities. She earned her master's degree in education of the deaf from Vanderbilt University and later returned to run its disability services program. In the years that followed, her passion for disability rights inspired her to pursue a law degree, which she earned at night as a night student at Fordham Law. While at the Disability Law Clinic at Hofstra Law School, she worked with individuals seeking accommodations for the bar exam. One of her cases went all the way to the Supreme Court and resulted in the plaintiff being awarded additional time for the bar exam due to having dyslexia. As a New York State legislator, Assemblymember Simon has an impressive record of advocating for those with disabilities. She has sponsored and supported bills aimed at improving dyslexia, teacher training, and intervention in New York schools. Among her many accomplishments in the Assembly, she passed a law in 2017 allowing the terms dyslexia, dysgraphia, and dyscalculia to be used on individual education programs. She was instrumental in establishing a statewide dyslexia task force to study and recommend best practices for identifying and supporting students with dyslexia. She has championed early universal screening for dyslexia to ensure that students receive timely support. She's also sponsored a bill requiring reading level assessment and dyslexia screening for individuals who are incarcerated. She has been a steadfast advocate and a coalition builder in her support of families and communities impacted by dyslexia. Thank you so much, Assemblymember Simon, for all you do in service of students in New York. It is my great honor to present to you the John J. Russell Award for Advocacy in Education. Please, now another round of applause. Thank you. Congrats.
I hope you got the Vanna move there. I don't get to do it very often. So thank you so much, Jamie, and thank you to everyone here for being here, and for those of you who are online, and your gracious introduction is so very much appreciated. And let me just say that anytime one's name is mentioned in the same breath as the amazing Jay Russell, it's a good day. So Jay, be the man, you know? Thank you, Jay. So as you have probably figured out, my journey in this field has been a long one. And but I want to clarify that I started at 12, and therefore I'm much younger than my record would make it sound. But I do want to talk about a couple of issues today, and I know I only have 3 minutes, and I'm a politician, so I'll take 5. But, you know, some of the things that I think are really powerful that we're doing now, and Jamie mentioned the Dyslexia Task Force, and the first bill in New York about dyslexia at all, which I passed in 2017. One of the problems we have, of course, is that not everybody knows about a bill or a law once it's passed. And so even after you pass it, you still have to work on getting the word out. And, you know, I am very grateful that we have been building more and more and more support in the state legislature for this. And, you know, one of the things that I learned decades ago and continues is that, you know, all teachers in training really need to know something about dyslexia, what it is, what it isn't. It's not reading backwards. I know you know that. Because every teacher will end up having a few students who have dyslexia in the classrooms and won't necessarily know what to do about it. They may recognize that they're struggling with reading, but they won't know what to do about it or why the student is struggling with reading. And the main reason that teachers haven't been able to tell whether a child might be struggling with dyslexia is because they haven't been taught how to teach reading that's aligned with the brain science. And the brain science we've known about for a long time. So this is a situation that is reflected in our persistently low reading scores nationally. Currently, New York has 4th graders reading proficiently is around 32% in the last NAEP results. That means we're failing over 65% of our kids. There are some kids who, of course, will have such intellectual disabilities they won't be able to read. That's a very small number. So we're really leaving about 60% of our kids behind. And this is something I have been complaining about since I was president of the local IDA here in New York. Very hard to get people's heads around the fact that teachers don't know necessarily how to teach reading. They're often taught a lot about reading, but not how to teach it. And that has been a real struggle for our teachers who are trying to do their best. They're doing what it is they've been taught, but in fact, it isn't necessarily working for enough of our kids. And so I want to report that we are actually changing that picture in New York State. And, you know, the task force report references the Path Forward initiative to ensure that colleges of education ensure that their students receive instruction in reading science and in addition receive instruction on how to deliver that instruction to their young students. And so what our Path Forward mission is to ensure that no longer will young people graduate from a college of education. We have 82 colleges of education in New York State, having learned something about reading, but not how to actually teach it. So what's the path forward, which you was a question you were going to ask me, I know. For the first time in its history, I have a few notes here, New York State's education ecosystem, in all the institutions in it, which is the state education department, the regions, the SUNY system, the CUNY system, the independent colleges and universities, the legislature, and the governor are working together. Nobody is doing this and pointing the finger at the other guy who didn't implement something. Everybody's working together to move in tandem to require that our post-secondary educational institutions teach their education students how to teach reading using evidence-based practices. And that is really, may not seem monumental, but is. I'm an active member of the steering committee, so I've witnessed firsthand the diligence of our leadership. I mean, the head of the Board of Regents, the head of the State Education Department, the Secretary for Education in the governor's office are there at these meetings all the time. So they're there for 2 hours at a time at these meetings. And they are all working together. And I think that that's really important. It gives me hope for the future. And it is something that really, I think, is the reason it is the path forward is that we're all working together. So it's historic, but it's also the most likely way to make change. So we have a state action plan. It was issued last October. It's online at the State Ed Department, the website. And we're working hard at implementing it. So number one, we're going to be assessing every K through 3 education program in our state for its alignment with the reading science. We're updating regulations. We're going to be updating our licensing exam. And we're supporting 10 pilots in education programs throughout the state, among other activities. And we're ensuring that our education faculty are given the necessary professional development. We find that the state regulations are good, and the guidelines are good in some ways, but they don't hang together in a cohesive fashion. And as you know, it needs to be systemic, it needs to be structured, it needs to be consistent, and they need to work together. So we're going to be able to address some of these persistent concerns that we've had that were identified by the task force, which most of us already knew. And that's a general lack of understanding about what dyslexia is and among educators, administrators, and parents. The lack of transparency around IDEA enforcement in New York State, and the state regulations, because we know so many kids who are not getting the services they deserve. And further, the lack of quality assessment in our schools that leads so many parents to really need costly private diagnostic evaluations, and the persistent use in our state of debunked ineffective methods and curricula that are still widely used in New York State. So we're going to be developing universal screening practices. That's been recommended by the task force as well, and building up the capacity in our schools and our school districts, as well as the State Department of Education, to really get into these issues, to provide the right kind of guidance to our schools and our school districts, so that we can actually make sure that what we are talking about here actually gets delivered to our kids, and that our state turns the corner. And so I just want to make sure that everybody's aware of it. You can check it out online. And also want to just put in a plug for Dyslexia Awareness Day, which we're calling Dyslexia Advocacy Day this year. It's our 10th anniversary. We bring folks up to Albany to talk about dyslexia, and it is really a very foundational part of our year now. And so we're going to be celebrating that on May 14th. And I left a few flyers out there for those of you who might be interested in coming. But you can certainly reach out to my office. We're online, and we'd be happy to send you whatever information you need. So I just wanted to share that information with you. I'm very grateful for this award. I'm very grateful for the work that you're doing. You know, the Windward Training Institute is something that everybody has known about forever. And it is really so remarkably wonderful and really doing such a terrific job in this field. It is legendary. So you have several legends here. Judith Hochman, who's a legend here. And so in addition to Jay Russell, who is not the only legend here, but a wonderful legend here. So I want to thank you, and thank you very much for bestowing upon me this very, very important and really incredible honor. Thank you so much.
And I think you had a front row experience here to understand why we felt it was so important to honor you with this work. So the things that you do, the way you bring people together, your passion for our kids is so clear. Thank you for everything you do for our kids and families in the state of New York. We are better for it. You know, the idea of many hands make for light work, and I think you are certainly one of those folks out in the community doing some incredible work, so thank you. And the other side, I would say that, as Jay mentioned earlier, you know, Jay grew up in Brooklyn, so we've got a Brooklyn representative here. honoring someone from Brooklyn. You know, it's such a great little kind of full circle moment for us. So, but tonight, as we think about the Schwartz lecture here, we are really thrilled to welcome Dr. Jeanne Wanzek to present our spring lecture. The annual Robert J. Schwartz Memorial Lecture was established by Miss Gail Ross in memory of her husband, Robert J. Schwartz. Robert was a compassionate and dedicated former member of our Board of Trustees who passed away in 1997. This lecture is in his memory, which brings to experts in the field of reading and reading disabilities to the school each spring. We have been fortunate to highlight the work of some incredibly prominent figures in the world of dyslexia, and tonight is no different. Dr. Wanzek has been decades of experience in effective reading practices and intervention. She began her career as a special education teacher and an elementary teacher. Later, she attained her master's degree and PhD in special education and learning disabilities. And she is currently based in Vanderbilt University as the Currey-Ingram Endowed Chair and an associate professor in the Department of Special Education at the Peabody College. To say Dr. Wanzek is a prolific researcher would be a massive understatement. She has published more than 100 academic articles, co-authored the book Intensive Reading Interventions for Elementary Grades, and been a contributing writer for 18 books and developed evidence-based curriculum and training materials. She was the keynote speaker for multiple conferences, including the Research and Practice Conference for the Center on Teaching and Learning. Literally dozens of conferences have invited Dr. Wanzek to present talks on early reading, learning disabilities, and intervention. She sits on the editorial boards of the Journal of Educational Psychology, Teaching Exceptional Children, the Annals of Dyslexia, and the Journal of Learning Disabilities, among others. This lecture this evening will examine the research on intensive reading interventions that are designed to support students with persistent reading challenges. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jeanne Wanzek for her presentation, The Science of Intensive Reading Interventions Across the Grades.
Thank you. Excuse me. I'm very glad to be here this evening. I had a wonderful day being able to get to see classrooms and various other aspects of the Windward School and Institute, and this is a great culmination to be here with all of you. I'm going to try and share tonight some of the science of reading of specifically intensive reading interventions, and I'll talk a little bit about what I mean about that. And that also means sharing some of what we actually don't know yet about intensive reading interventions. So what we do know and what we don't know, or at least a little bit of what we don't know, and hope to continue to research. The science of reading is an ongoing thing that we continue to learn more about. As was already mentioned, I, on a very day-to-day basis, am a teacher and a researcher who focuses specifically on reading interventions. However, as I was getting ready to come here yesterday, I was taking my youngest child to school. He's 5, and he suddenly said from the back seat, "Oh, Mommy, there you are on the staircase." And I sort of looked around, and after figuring out what he was talking about, there was a billboard that apparently is my second job as a model for Cartier. Apparently that's how he sees me, which is fine. So as I'm sharing things we don't know, if you're disappointed or angry at anything I say, I encourage you to think of me in that way instead. All right, so intensive interventions. Intervention in general and reading instruction in general, to be able to focus on intensive interventions, we need to think a little bit about how intervention, or how I'm talking about intervention, is different than what we might call core instruction in a more traditional type of school. So of course in your average public school, which I know we have some audience members, at least online, are a part of, you are providing reading instruction to all students, right? Not just students who might have a reading difficulty or a reading disability. And that requires going through all of the grade level standards, but there also are students in those classrooms who do have difficulties and disabilities. Those are the students that I largely work with. And intervention then is often supplemental to the core instruction. So students who are having those reading difficulties or reading disabilities are receiving what we might call core classroom grade level instruction. and receiving some intervention to help them better access that general education. And that's true in schools like Windward as well. Our overall goal is to help students accelerate their learning in particular areas so that they can access all aspects of instruction that are available to them throughout their school life. So intervention is different from core instruction in the sense that it's designed to look at the highest, or to help students with the highest impact areas of their reading that will help them accelerate that aspect of their instruction to better access the gen ed curriculum. And when we are in a school like Windward, or we have several schools that I work with in Nashville that are very similar, we are still helping them access that while also giving them that instruction, because of course we're in charge of both the core and the intervention all integrated together. And so then when we're thinking about intensive interventions, which is what I'm going to focus on tonight, we are looking at the interventions for the students who have the most significant difficulties or disabilities, for whom our sort of general science of reading is not necessarily enough. So we know how to give good instruction to a kid who's coming into kindergarten, first grade, and get them on track in many cases. We even know for students who might fall a little bit early on like that, need a little bit of intervention to accelerate, we know pretty specifically what the majority of those students will need to accelerate, get back to accessing the gen ed curriculum, and continue in a successful way. But there are students who need more individualized instruction. You all know that. That's part of the reason that you're here. And those tend to be our more intensive interventions. And we know many ways to intensify interventions in reading. And there are some things we don't know. And so that's where I'm going to sort of contextualize what I'm talking about tonight. Just to give a little bit of additional information towards that, Russell Gersten and his colleagues kind of defined for us these less intensive interventions. Sometimes in traditional schools, those are called tier 2 interventions. They're sort of a first step for students who might have just fallen a little bit behind but don't necessarily have a disability. They tend to be in those situations supplemental, small group interventions that address the major components and build on of reading and build on the foundational skills around that. And they start to introduce more systematic, more highly explicit and interactive types of instruction, and of course progress monitoring, which is the data we collect to see where students might still need some more instruction. And then he goes further to identify these more, or to define these more intensive interventions, sometimes in more traditional contexts called tier 3 types of instruction. And those are provided, as I mentioned already, to students who are not necessarily progressing after a reasonable amount of time with initial intervention. And we're still talking about good reading instruction. These might be students who either have more significant difficulties or maybe even a reading disability, where we need to get more focused and targeted, maybe more extended instruction with extensive practice and ongoing data that will help us better diagnose where they are needing areas of instruction. Again, this more intensive or tier 3 area is where I'm going to focus tonight in terms of the research. The Intensive Interventions Center, the National Center of Intensive Interventions, but their website is intensiveinterventions.org. So if you haven't heard of that or have never visited their website, I encourage you to do so. They have a lot of wonderful resources on there for both teachers and families. They identify or define these intensive interventions as being designed to address the more severe and persistent learning, and they also have intensive interventions for behavior difficulties as well. Interventions that are characterized by increased intensity, more time, smaller group, we'll talk a little bit about that, and individualization of instruction for students that are showing slower or inadequate response to more traditional approaches of good reading instruction. So to sort of further contextualize this a little bit, I want to just talk a little bit about our students, because that's who we care so much about, and our children. For those of you who are families, I'm a parent as well. Obviously, my youngest is my favorite after that comment, but I do have 3 children. And so I want to talk a little bit about what we know. Some of this, many of you already know, so we'll kind of test your knowledge here with some myths and facts that were already, some of which were already brought up with our award. And then take a look at the sort of student side of this, or the child side of this, before I get into the research about intensive interventions. So individuals with reading disabilities have low intelligence. Myth or fact? Myth, absolutely. People with reading disabilities, average to above average intelligence. There's a specific area in reading in terms of some of the brain science that we need to consider in terms of our instruction. Myth or fact, reading disabilities are treatable. Fact, there are successful treatments. We're going to talk about some of them today. While that disability may be a lifelong aspect, early and effective intervention help them access all of and be successful in all of the areas of life, even as they include reading. And as we can implement that very well and to the extent possible early, we can also minimize secondary aspects that can happen when you have a disability in reading, like low self-esteem or feeling like something is wrong with you. Myth or fact, most students will respond quickly to intensive intervention support. Ooh, a little bit more. Good, myth. Although treatable, and some students might respond quickly to intensive supports and return to less intensive support fairly quickly, many will require ongoing intensive support. Some students demonstrate periods of adequate progress, but then as you see the curriculum changing or a new context within that, there may be new places where either intervention or thinking about individualized needs happens again. And this happens as students can better access the general ed curriculum and then have more and more time where they're not in intervention and are accessing that general ed curriculum. There tend to be new contexts or teachers that they will encounter all the way through college who have less information about how to best individualize for them. And so some of these areas will come up for them again. We see as students get older, and if we have time, I'll be able to share a couple individual studies along these lines too, that as students get older, you'll see often a lot of research studies will do a school year, maybe only a semester of intervention, and we won't see much difference. But if you take them 2 or 3 years through that intervention, you'll start to see where they're really accelerating their learning. And so these are not short fixes for students who have a reading disability, at least for most students. And they may need additional support at different time points throughout their life. But again, it is treatable, and we do have ways to assist students. All right. Corrective eyewear is an effective treatment for reading disability. Very good. More confident on that one. Yeah, we have decades of research to show it's not a visual aspect that is going on. And so it is the science of reading that we need and not other aspects of that. Children with reading disabilities write letters and/or words backwards. We already had that mentioned. It is to a certain extent a myth and a fact. It is mostly a myth. It's not about the reading disability. We do know that many children reverse letters when they're learning to write, regardless of whether or not they have a reading disability. That has more to do with where you are developmentally in learning how to read. So you will see a student with a reading disability or dyslexia possibly do that, but that is simply because they are at the beginning stage of reading, regardless of what their actual age might be. If you think about print, it is one of the first times in a child's life, or if a student is struggling with print, it might go a little further into their age, that something in their world changes based on its position in space. So I have a bottle of water, and whether I turn that upside down or sideways or whatever I do with it, it's always a bottle of water, right? And that's not so with print. So you take something like the letter P, and we turn it around, and now it's a Q, and then it's a B, and then it's a D. And so it's the first time that the brain has to become malleable to thinking in that way for many students. And so you'll see when we get to kind of the student thing, we'll see students who themselves, as they start to describe what it's like having dyslexia or a reading disability, that's one of the things that they will describe. Like it just, all these print things as they change, I don't notice the changes, and that can make it difficult for students. All right, a couple more. Students should receive academic and behavioral supports concurrently as they're getting intervention. Fact, yes. So as there are other aspects, attention, who can pay, even as an adult, lengthy attention to things that are incredibly taxing and difficult for you cognitively, or maybe that you don't even want to do, right? So sometimes there are attention or other behavioral aspects, particularly if students are not getting the instruction that is helping them be successful. What we know most about motivation and engagement is success is really related to that. So if you are in a situation with something that is very difficult for you and you are not receiving the instruction that is helping you be successful, you might see some of these behavioral aspects. It is not a matter of dealing with the behavior first and then they can learn. We need to work on these things concurrently as one, they're very correlated in most cases. All right, so as most of you would recognize, I'm not going to read all of this list because most of you would recognize that this is the signs and the symptoms of a reading disability. We know that it's language-based. Print is one aspect of it. There certainly can be spoken language aspects of it as well. Comprehension goes with dyslexia, even if the main issue is about changing the print into language. And we see, as a result, students also having difficulty with spelling, sometimes learning a foreign language because they were dealing with language again. And these difficulties are not easily remediated, even with research-based interventions. We need these more intensive or individualized interventions in most cases. All right, so one more piece of contextualization before we kind of dive into what some of the research says and doesn't say about intensive intervention, and that is, what do our students with reading disabilities say when they're trying to access the general ed curriculum? So that might be some of these students are talking about their experiences initially learning how to read, perhaps in a more traditional school before they were identified as having a reading disability. And or some of these are people who have had reading disabilities, dyslexia, they're now adults, and thinking back on, okay, after I did have good intervention and then I had to access the general ed curriculum without some of those supports, what are some of the things I experienced? As I said, a lot of them are before they had really good instruction or before they had a place like Windward to come to and some of the experiences that they had. My teacher tells me to sound it out or break it in half, but she never taught me how to do that. I don't know how to do that, so I just pretend, and then she tells me the word. Sometimes my teacher won't explain it, meaning what they have read about, and when I ask for an explanation, she'll say, well, why don't you understand what we're talking about? Why haven't you completed the work? And I'll complain that she didn't explain it right, that I don't understand it, and then she just says, well, you should be able to understand it by now. And this kind of gets to some aspects of not necessarily a poor teacher who has done this, but a teacher, who's working with a lot of different students and doesn't have the knowledge or the background to individualize for students who might have reading difficulties or disabilities, and is working more from a model of, if I taught it, then they should have learned it, right? Rather than, regardless of whether I taught it, did they learn it? It means I didn't probably teach it if they didn't learn it. It would be good if my teacher taught the same way every day, but sometimes it's this, some days it's this way, then the next day we learn another way. And that's, again, perspective of the child with a reading disability that other students in that class may not feel. They may see those connections where some of our students are not seeing those connections, and it just feels different every day. My daddy can't read and I can't read that good. He couldn't help me learn to read, and I guess I won't be able to help my kids either. Getting through these quotes without crying is difficult for me, because we care about these students, right? Understand that sometimes I'm just afraid to read and the fear makes me crazy. You see, I have to be reconciled with that. I want to be cool and I want to be a good reader, and sometimes the two don't mix well. Sometimes it's just better if you go along with everybody else. Part of what we do in intensive interventions or places like Windward is help students get confident, not only in their success, right, but that it's okay to be who you are in that space. She teaches us how to break up words in groups or into little parts, or take prefixes and suffixes and root words to help you figure out the words you don't know. We are working on 2-syllable words. Take happy, and this is a student saying this. This was an elementary student. I'd break it up in the middle P, and then I would try to sound it out. Also, my teacher shows us how to read. She is the best teacher in special education. They always raise their hands to read. They are able to pronounce the words and answer the teacher's questions about the reading assignments. Poor readers, and then the student named some of her classmates, are like me. I tell the teacher that I don't want to read because I'll feel embarrassed and think that they all, the good readers, laugh at me. If you don't know how to read, you will not get a job. The only thing you can do, actually, if you don't know how to read, you can't do anything. The only thing I can think of is being an artist, and they would have to read still. Any of you are artists, don't take that personally. So there's nothing. Maybe you could walk a dog. That's if you know how to read stop signs. We always need to read. There's no job in this world that you don't need to read. And that is a difficult spot for students who aren't feeling successful in reading. It is all around our world, right? And it comes up even in their social situations, particularly as they get older. This is an adult speaking about his previous experience. When I looked at pages of words, I just thought they were a whole bunch of drawings that people were doing, like really neat drawings. Writing to me, it was nothing. People could tell me that's A, and I'd be like, okay, that's A, that must be A too, but it would be a C or an F or something. I always thought that they, the letters, were just weird numbers. Honestly, I thought I was just really stupid and that it was because I was either lazy or didn't want to try. But I knew it had something to do with my brain, and I kind of figured it was a disease. If you have dyslexia, the thing you have to find is how to get over the hump, the wall. Basically, you either go around it and just don't read and get along in life without it, or you break down the wall. And that's a kid who did find successful intervention for him or herself. I don't really know why, but actually I think it's kind of like a snowflake. All dyslexic kids read differently or have a different advantage and disadvantage, so each snowflake would be different, but similar, but not the same. I like that one. And this being experience as well. I do not know when I was labeled as learning disabled. It was not until junior high or maybe into high school, this is an adult looking back, that the term LD started to surface with frequency. For years, my fellow LDers and I wondered what LD meant. No one ever told us. We did know that it set us apart from others and that we were different. Being LD was not something that we received awards for. It was secretive and suspicious. It was something talked about in hushed tones. It was discussed at secret parent-teacher meetings. It was the reason that I had to go to summer school. Is it any surprise then that before I knew what LD meant, I felt ashamed about being LD? And that too is something that related to that self-esteem that we were talking about, that we try to break down those walls. And a final one, some of which well, actually, I think there's one more after this one, but some of which we don't always think about as these students are trying to access the general ed curriculum is the effort that they are putting on. Now, if you're a parent, you know exactly what's happening. But this, again, is an adult. My teacher had us keep a weekly journal, thinking back on his experience. Each week, I could write about anything I wanted, and I was only supposed to take 10 minutes. I was not supposed to worry about punctuation or spelling. So you can see a teacher like just saying, just write about your thoughts, like thinking this is a fairly easy assignment. At first, this assignment scared me. I knew I would have to put more than 10 minutes into it to simply get a pass. In fact, I typically spent 3 hours into each journal entry. And a final one, my dyslexia is like a bubble. I am enclosed in an invisible sheath that allows me to come excitingly close to being quote unquote normal, but never completely there. And that gets towards some of the lifelong supports that we're talking about, the new contexts and new areas for kids who really need intensive interventions continue along that myth that this is something we can treat quite quickly, continue to need those supports. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what we do know about these intensive interventions for kids exactly like that. I'm going to start with early elementary. So this is research on kindergarten through 3rd grade. and particularly intensive interventions, which is difficult in the research to pull because how intensive is defined is quite different in different contexts. So I'll tell you how we kind of looked at this. So my colleagues and I looked at all the research studies where students were either in K through 3, where students were either identified with learning disabilities in reading or at risk, because in kindergarten or first grade, often you show some risk signs, but it may or may not turn out later to be a disability. We don't have perfect markers for the youngest kids until they're reading to know if they already have a reading disability or will have it. So this is early literacy intervention. So it was not part of the general education curriculum. This wasn't instruction that was for all kids. It was specific for kids who were showing difficulties. And we did all the studies that were intense in terms of their duration. So their instruction had differing levels of intensity, but they were implemented for 100 sessions or more, which is in an elementary school, basically the school year, so at least a year of that. And overall, the good news, and this won't surprise most of you, particularly the educators, acceleration of learning, when you look at all the studies together, there were 25 of them that just looked at intensive interventions. Reading research is a lot more than that, even on interventions. And acceleration in learning was significant. Now, I want to contextualize a little bit of what I'm going to talk about here in 2 ways. One, when we're talking about acceleration in learning, these studies compared students who were randomly assigned to get this intensive intervention, whichever one it was they were studying, and they were compared to other students who were randomly assigned, so other students with difficulties or disabilities who were randomly assigned to continue the instruction, which included intervention that they were already getting. So if you think about like some of the medical research that you know, it was not a comparison of you're randomly assigned to get the pill and then the other people don't get the pill. It would be a comparison of you're randomly assigned to get the pill and the other people get the current existing pill. Does that make sense? So it's a pretty rigorous comparison, because it's not like the other kids weren't getting intervention. They were. It was just looking at, this research is looking at, okay, if we intensify in this way or this way or this way, can we further accelerate learning? So that's the first piece. So acceleration means that the intervention that was being implemented was better than our current interventions at that time of the research study that was going on. And then this effect size that's up there, this is, it puts a marker on the amount of acceleration. And typically, these are in what we call standard deviations, but typically in education research, an effect size of what we would call a fifth of a standard deviation, which is 0.20, is something we start to pay attention to. Like, if that's my kid, I want that instruction to happen. And it gets, anything larger than that is even more significant. Typically around 0.2 to 0.3, we consider a small effect size, but meaningful. Around 0.5 is like a medium effect size. And if you're getting upwards of a full standard deviation, so a 1.00 effect size, that's very large and something we want to pay attention to. I kind of mentioned a comparison to something that more of us are familiar with, which was medical research. And they start to pay attention at like 0.10, so much, much smaller. So these are, this is not set in stone what is meaningful, but in education we tend to do around 0.2 or higher. But there are arguments out there from researchers that we should pay attention, as does the medical research, at even lower levels. So this is kind of a moderate effect, and this is all of them together. So, as we look at intensive interventions and the things we know about intensive interventions, can we accelerate learning? Yes, and at the K3 level. And we kind of broke it down, because one of the things I want you to understand about the research in intensive interventions, and this is the part that you might be disappointed about, and then you should remember my beautiful red dress on the stairway, that when we're just looking at intensive intervention research for K3, it's really only K1. There is just not any research. There's one study that we found for second and third grade, and one that had done K3 and put them all together. So they included second and third, but you couldn't tease it out. So we couldn't look at the effects for kind of those more at-risk students, which was K1. different from the kids where you are more able to tell if they already have a reading disability at 2nd and 3rd grade. And that's not that different even if you widen out of intensive interventions. 2nd and 3rd grade has a lot less research even for the less intensive interventions than kindergarten and first. So that is an area we still need to continue doing more work in. But with that knowledge that this is largely kindergartners and first graders, we see higher effects. So what you have here is the average effect. These are more effect sizes. So 0.33, about 1/3 of a standard deviation, if you're familiar with that, or a small effect size to accelerate a student's learning. But in parentheses, there is kind of the range of statistically where where it could fall. So it could be as high as moderate. It could be as low as just small. And although these are not in a statistical sense different, you see a trend towards more hours in intervention. For kids who need intensive interventions, you're going to get better effects. So that gets towards our myth or fact about where our impact is, and that's going to be over time. It's not a quick fix for most students. We also looked at group size. Now, there weren't any large groups in this particular research at the K-3 level. When I get to the upper grades, we'll have a different problem, but they were small groups of like 6 and less, or there were quite a few studies that just did one-on-one. Again, this is actually no difference in a statistical sense, meaning that it's similar, small group or one-on-one. But you do see a trend towards a higher, more acceleration for some of the one-on-one. And some of that has to do with, you can widen out. It has to do with some of the samples. So some of the samples that were more significant to be that did one-on-one. So there's some other things that go on there to contribute to the small group versus one-on-one. Another thing that an earlier study looked at, which is why it doesn't have an average effect size, it just has all the studies information in this range here, was the extent to which if you use kind of a program that's very standardized, maybe even scripted for the teacher and they're implementing it, not regardless, I mean, they certainly pay attention to the student's needs, but they're not purposely individualizing on a day-to-day basis for each individual student in their group, versus a lower standard deviation where they are making very purposeful decisions each day to more individualize. We don't see differences in students' acceleration at the K-3 level when it's more individualized versus a higher level of standard deviation. Now, of course, they're still paying attention to student needs in terms of what they are teaching, how quickly they're moving, whether they've mastered it or not. So there's still individualization within the instruction. We think most of the studies that were lower standard deviation tended to require a lot on the teacher for making the materials and making the lessons. Which in and of itself requires a very high level of knowledge and time. There's a reason that people who create the materials that are available have that as a full-time job, and they don't then also teach all day, right? So some of this is probably just the difficulty of implementation when you're doing the lower standard deviation, or standardization, sorry. All right, so we know a lot at K1. We know a little bit about some of the intensity places, including smaller groups, longer period of time in intervention, if that time is used well. And then we took a look in a similar way at 4th grade and up the research on that, intending to go all the way through 12th grade, though again, we will find some gaps there of things that haven't been studied well. And here we were looking at students, like I said, in 4th through 12th grade. These students had already been identified with a reading or learning disability or a significant reading difficulty in terms of the assessment that they provided in terms of how far below grade level they were. Because of the secondary nature, middle and secondary, we did 75 sessions or more because that's more a semester. Some of those more traditional schools work on kind of a semester-long scheduling. So we did 75 or more for that. And again, not part of the curriculum that all the students were receiving. So just these intensive interventions. Here we were able to find 19 studies. There are a few more since we have done this synthesis. So that's good news. But here it was largely middle school at the time. A big place, and some of my colleagues and I have contributed to this, a big place where the research has grown since we did this is in 4th and 5th grade. So we had noticed the gap in upper elementary and started to focus on that. There were 3 studies that included students in 9th grade in this research that I'm going to share, but no studies at 10th, 11th, or 12th grade. So that is a complete hole, and that is true in even less intensive interventions too, that high school level. It's very difficult to do research at the high school level is part of it, but we certainly need some more information there. Most of these interventions were multi-component, meaning they addressed, if not 4 or 5 of the components of reading, the phonics and word recognition, the fluency, the vocabulary, the comprehension, they at least addressed 2 or 3. You can probably guess that when you have students in the upper grades, they're usually struggling in more than one area. Or if they're struggling significantly in one area, after they catch that up, they need to, have some support in terms of how to apply that to the other areas like comprehension. So most of these were multi-component implementations. This is set up a little bit differently, which is to look at where the acceleration occurred in terms of their outcomes. So these are the outcome, the first column is the test that they took at the end of the intervention. So if it was a comprehension test, what were the effects across all these studies? If it was a fluency test, et cetera. You can see the effects are much smaller when we get to secondary. So we don't see any in terms of average effects, any of those 0.2 or 0.3, or some of our other ones were up to 0.4 and 0.5 with our little, with our K3s, right? So comprehension. The good news is these multi-component interventions were affecting all areas, and even though comprehension is trending lower, it's not actually, from a statistical sense, different than the other effects. You can affect all areas of reading at the secondary level with these intensive interventions, and so that's really good news, but it is smaller than our early intervention kids. So again, we looked at group size and amount of intervention, and I already shared with you some of the grade level, but I'm going to show you kind of a comparison across the elementary and secondary at the end here. So here it was a better split to do a few more hours. These students in the upper grades tended to be getting longer interventions in the research studies already. So instead of the 63 hours, we did a little higher, which was a good break in the research, 115 hours, which is about, for most of them, 24 weeks or so of intervention, so almost a school year. And we see not a lot of difference in the number of studies or effects that we could look at towards that, but trending upwards again towards more time in intervention. And these students who need intensive intervention, especially as we get into the secondary grades, it's not going to happen quickly. So that 0.09 is really starting to get close to not accelerating their learning beyond the typical interventions that were already going on. Group size also trends towards smaller group size. Now here, we didn't have studies that did, or at least enough studies that did one-on-one. So it was groups of 5 plus, and then groups that were smaller than 5. When you have that comparison, it starts to become more meaningful effect size with the smaller groups. And then, as I mentioned, we already had quite, there weren't a lot of grade levels we could look at, but in terms of the upper elementary versus the middle school, it's kind of interesting that the middle school, even though it's a higher grade and they might have more difficulties than the kids in the upper elementary, do have higher effects. There are some other things going on there in terms of the other intensity variables of the interventions that were being implemented that might explain that. And here's just a comparison of what we see at early elementary in terms of these mean effect sizes being more moderate. So what we know about intensity for kids in K3, and as we already pointed out, that's largely K1, and what we know about intensity for the upper grades. The effect sizes go down markedly for each of our different outcomes: comprehension, fluency, word reading, word fluency, which is reading words but timed. So it's your fluency but just on word reading instead of text, and spelling. All of them are higher if we can intervene earlier. There is one other piece to that, though, besides the early intervention, and that is we have some kids in these early elementary, since they're largely K1, who maybe don't have a reading disability. So you might have these higher effects because they were at risk, but they were able to accelerate faster than a kid who actually has a reading disability. So both things are going on. Early intervention is certainly important, but it's important to understand that since we don't have a lot of second and third grade studies in that early elementary, we may have some kids who are just at risk. All right, so overall, what we know about intensive intervention across the grade levels. First off, only really high quality experimental or what we call quasi-experimental studies that have random assignment or really are showing that the groups are matched in the different treatments and are actually comparing an intensive intervention to something else, as opposed to just looking at a kid's growth from fall to spring, which we all grow, especially if you're in first or second grade. Even if you have a reading disability, you grow from fall to spring, even if you're not getting instruction that is the best for you. So by comparing that, we can get rid of just normal growth and really look at what is the best instruction, what is the highest potential our kids can do. So the good thing is that we do have high quality studies that show these intensive interventions can have significant effects for students at both the elementary and secondary, because even though those effect sizes are lower, they're significantly different than the kids who weren't getting those more intensive interventions. The outcomes are higher at the early elementary level. And we know that we have mostly middle school and kindergarten, first grade studies. And now we have more fourth and fifth grade studies as well, though those aren't all intensive interventions. High school is a place that needs to be worked on, and second and third grade we know a lot less about than we admit. A lot of times you will see when they do these summaries, kind of like my title page was K3, because we tried to find K3, so that was my title page, right? And then either they don't say or you don't notice that it's actually K1. And so a lot of practice guides and those kinds of things are basing their instruction on this K1 research when really we need some more second and third grade as well. And like I said, most of the intensive intervention for the upper grades are very recent, and we need continued research on these intensity variables, which I'm gonna kind of segue into as well. So a couple specific examples before I talk about some of these intensity variables and we finish up for the night. I pulled a couple individual studies that were from the upper grades because I thought it was kind of interesting to see, instead of just looking at it as a whole, kind of interesting to see what they're exactly looking at in terms of comparing these interventions. So this is a study by Jeanne Wanzek and her colleagues that looked at 7th and 8th grade students who had already been through a pretty intensive intervention in 6th and 7th grade and had insufficient response. So they did grow, but not, they weren't closing the gap towards getting towards grade level in terms of being able to read successfully. And so they were randomly assigned to either receive that more standardized treatment, which was a more scripted kind of program. We do these things each day, and we do this amount of time on fluency and this amount of time on comprehension and phonics. And then, decisions were made in terms of, they were in small groups, so decisions were made in terms of the small group about when to move on or where the starting point was, but it wasn't individualized beyond that, and their progress was monitored as well. Or they were randomly assigned to this more individualized treatment, where the amount of time they spent on each of the components or the lesson that they were doing was completely based on individual student needs on a day-to-day basis. So the teacher was, making a lot of decisions about how to put different materials together, or we're going to spend more time on fluency because that seems to be the area, less time on this, and that would change on a day-to-day basis. And then still compared to the typical school intervention. Both the individualized, and so they addressed reading fluency, word study included both phonics, spelling, and word recognition. And they also addressed vocabulary and reading comprehension, and text reading, of course, was a part of that. Both of the interventions, the standardized or the individualized, so this is an individual study that kind of shows what I was sharing before with the early elementary. had significantly better outcomes in comprehension than the students who were just in the typical school intervention. This was a traditional middle school serving all students. But there were no differences between whether they got the standardized or they got the individualized. So just getting the more intensive intervention was the most important part than how individualized it was. And we talked about earlier some of the difficulties on the teacher of truly individualizing might explain some of that. This is an individual study that looks a little bit deeper at the group size that I was sharing. So we didn't have any one-on-one studies, remember, in the 412 area. But these, again, were 7th and 8th grade students who either got their intervention in a more large group, 10 to 15 students, had it in their middle school schedule. Again, these were in traditional public schools, or got their intervention in a group of 3 to 5 students. Now, we know from several studies at the elementary level that that difference makes a huge acceleration in their outcomes. You go down to 3 to 5 students and you have a huge jump in student outcomes than if you have a group of 10 when we're talking about elementary. So this study was designed to try that at the middle school. Does it make the same type of difference? And again, compared to typical school intervention. They addressed a multi-component intervention or those areas. And for these older students, we don't get the same outcomes that we saw at elementary for that kind of reduction. Now, obviously, this didn't look at all the different ways to, make your group size smaller. But again, both the large and small group did better than the typical school intervention. So again, it was the intensive delivery of the instruction that was more important than whether they had 10 or 5 students in the group. And there weren't a lot of differences. It was 50 minutes a day for 1 year. When this study finished, these students had made progress, but not in a lot of areas to alter their outcomes in terms of being successful readers. But these students that were in this study continued for a 2nd and then 3rd year. And you start to see those differences after the 2nd and 3rd year. So again, that gets towards our earlier myth or fact. It does take time, especially as students are older, to see the outcomes, at least with what we currently know. And this is one of my favorite studies. It's an old one, but it just had incredible outcomes. This is a colleague of mine who hired me into my first faculty position, Joe Torgeson. He is retired now. But a wonderful man, and he did this incredible study with students who had already been identified with learning disabilities and put them in what for an elementary level, these were 4th graders, for an elementary level was a very significant amount of time in intervention. Now, something that the Windward School, does already, but many traditional schools will say, like, even for our most, delayed or student who has a disability, 45 minutes or 60 minutes is the most we can give in terms of additional intervention. And so 2 50-minute sessions daily for 8 to 9 weeks, which is a very short amount of time. They were one-on-one as well, was a fairly unusual and still is a fairly unusual research study to be able to do with kids who are in more traditional schools. And all of the kids had very large changes in their standard scores. So they didn't have a comparison group of kids who was getting a typical intervention like I've showed in the other studies. But they did use their standard scores, which means that the assessments they were giving already compare to where you should be in terms of your age and your grade. So if you stay at the same standard score, that means you're making 1 year's growth each time, which is what is expected if you're already on grade level. But of course, if you have a disability, you're probably not on grade level. And so the only way to get closer to grade level is if your standard scores are going up while your peers are making 1 year change. And so these were large changes in standard scores across all the areas of reading: decoding, word reading, spelling, fluency, comprehension. Several of the students after this study exited special education and were getting most of their access to instruction through general education. He looked at 2 different types of interventions, one that was a little bit more explicit in terms of its phonics and word recognition instruction, it tended to follow more of an OG, Orton-Gillingham type of approach, and more of an embedded phonics, which was still very explicit. So I don't want to, if you haven't read the study, I don't want to suggest otherwise from that title. But it was a little less explicit than the Orton-Gillingham, and it did have a bit more text reading that was a part of the time than the other kids got. And there were no differences between those. So what we learned from that is good explicit instruction is good. There's not a particular program necessarily that it has to be, but the incredible changes that students had in what is actually a fairly short amount of time with just a lot of intervention was quite incredible. So that's why I share that one. All right, so just a couple things before we finish about intensive reading interventions in terms of what we think about given that research. So what I'm going to share now is kind of what they were doing in these interventions that showed that acceleration, and this gets towards, what some of you already know as the science of reading, but how can we intensify that further? We know that small groups and one-on-one are good ways to provide intensive interventions. They need to be frequent and continuous. We talked about the explicit and systematic instruction. Lots of engagement and responding, and there are ways that we can intensify that to help students further accelerate their learning. Feedback is another really well-researched area that's often forgotten that we can use that to intensify interventions, and of course, keeping track of individual data to do that. So a couple points that I want to make regarding this. Teaching students how to do something is that explicit instruction. Where is that often forgotten in our interventions is in reading comprehension. So we have gotten really good with the science of reading, and not, of course, not every classroom, not every teacher, but those of us and those of you who have a lot of knowledge about this have gotten very, very good at providing explicit instruction in phonics and word recognition. And to a certain extent, in oral language and vocabulary, though it starts to slip a little bit there. But if you go into classrooms around the nation, the place where you see truly explicit instruction the least is when teachers are teaching reading comprehension. And that is a place that we can really make a difference, especially for older students, but even youngers. And that can be listening comprehension too, not just reading comprehension. So actually teaching them how to comprehend it, not just asking them questions and seeing if they did comprehend it, which is more of an assessment. Another place that we can really intensify interventions is actually thinking about what the students are actively engaging their brains in. What deliberate practice are they getting? We know that opportunities for practice is really important. How much are they getting to practice these things that we're teaching them? But what is the cognitive work that's actually going on with that? So sometimes we're asking one student a question, and that is a practice opportunity, but there may be other students who are not cognitively engaging in that. They might be quiet, they might be listening, but their brains are actually not doing that practice. Does that make sense? And so they are not actively engaged in that particular practice opportunity. And that's not to say that, we have to always find ways that everybody is at every given moment. But paying attention to, often when I teach and I think about the practice opportunities I get, I think about my lesson as a whole and my class as a whole, even if it's a small group. And I don't often think about, well, wait, what did Maria actually get practice on, or what did she actually cognitively engage in? And sometimes this has to do with the activities that we do as well. So take a kindergarten activity. We're learning about the letter A and the sound the letter A makes. And a teacher hands out something for them to make the letter A, and then they get to color it. They might be cognitively engaging while they're coloring it if they're saying the letter and saying the sound. But if you're just giving them a few minutes to color it, they're probably not actively engaging about the letter A while they're doing that, right? So a lot of times we put activities in, and I do this myself, without really thinking about, is this deliberate practice of the goal that I have for today or the objective that I have for today with this activity? Or how much of that time is actually deliberate practice where their brains are cognitively in that. And so sometimes intensity is as simple as that, just taking a look at my lesson plans and where I can get more deliberate practice and cognitive engagement. I talked about feedback being one of the most researched places that we have in our field, and we can really use that to intensify interventions. It is really important when you are talking about feedback, and this kind of gets to the cognitive engagement, that the feedback, if it's corrective, is at the level of what to do and how to do it, and not at the mistake that was made. Whatever your brain practices is what you're going to remember tomorrow. And so if there's a lot of language around what you did wrong, that's what you're going to remember tomorrow. And that's true for all of us. That's true for an adult. So if it's something you're struggling with, it's even more confusing. So yes, a quick like, oh, this one needs a correction or whatnot, and then the focus has got to be on how to do it or what the correct answer is, so that that practice is in the right area. So a couple things that, these are ways, and then I'm going to kind of skip ahead a little bit. These are ways that we think about intensifying interventions through scheduling, more time, smaller group. Only good if you actually use that time in that smaller group rather than just doing the lesson slower. So do they get more activity, more practice opportunities? Is it more individualized because it's a smaller group? Do they get more instruction because there's more time? Do they get to move faster? Those kinds of things. Thinking about the instructional content that students, that's what we tend to do. So he's having trouble in reading fluency. I need to make sure I'm addressing reading fluency. But considering those high impact areas. So what is the highest impact in phonics and word recognition for the student to be able to be successful at reading, and making sure that we're thinking through those areas. And then what I'm going to kind of skip ahead to is this instructional delivery, which is the area that is most forgotten in terms of intensifying. But what we're seeing in the research is if you're doing these other areas, you really need to pay attention to those feedback, those explicit, systematic. It's a dynamic process. Unless it's a discrete skill, you can get more explicit and then more explicit again. And that didn't work for this kid, more explicit again. You can do more systematic instruction. What's a manageable step for you is maybe not a manageable step for you, so I make it more manageable, I break it down further, and maybe I still have to break it down further for me. It's a very dynamic process. And as we can give more explicit and systematic instruction, thinking about it as manageable steps, what's manageable for this child and how explicit does this child need it, we can get a more intense intervention. Interestingly, one of the ways that we are really good in our world about explicit and systematic instruction is with physical types of learning. So if I'm going to teach a child how to go down a slide, or I'm going to teach a child how to ride a bike, we, as parents or whoever's with the child, we have a tendency to make it very explicit because we know if it's not a manageable step for them, they're going to get hurt, right? They're going to get physically hurt. So maybe some kids just need kind of an explanation of the ladder, or here's how you go down. Other kids need to do it with you in your lap, right? They need the training wheels or hold on to the bike, and we do this kind of step by step, and that's really what intensive interventions need. And I would argue that even though we can't see how they got hurt if they didn't have that explicit and systematic instruction, they got hurt if they didn't have that explicit and systematic instruction. And so thinking about academics more the way that we think about some of the things where it's more obvious perhaps to us of how to break it down can really make interventions more intense. Providing this ample practice and the immediate feedback. And I already kind of talked about these feedback areas, but focusing on the correct answer and how to do the task correctly rather than the mistake, and making sure it's process-oriented feedback. So not you're correct or good work on the assignment, but more specific about what was actually done. You organized your written response well with that advanced organizer. You got the correct answer, but next time explain the evidence that you found in the text, or being more specific and intentional with our feedback. The effect sizes on changing your feedback are like in the 1.0s. They are those large feedback areas. And so that's a key area for intensive interventions. All right. As we already talked about, as a final thing here, the other place where we think about intensifying interventions is through some of the cognitive processes. So the memory, the attention. We know that for kids who are having any difficulties in this area, that treatments that just focus on that, so I'm going to try and improve your attention, or I'm going to try and improve your working memory, don't work. But they do work when they're integrated into the area of difficulty. So if we can help students with what they should be thinking about, demonstrating more overtly some of the things that just happen in your brain through think alouds, helping them learn how to self-regulate in reading, not just generally self-regulate, thinking about what they do and don't understand while they're reading, tracking their progress, which is also, of course, related to motivation. Those kinds of integrated treatments can make an intervention more intense as well and improve reading outcomes for students. As I already mentioned, the biggest thing related to motivation in reading is success. Most of the time that you see a child not motivated in reading, it's because they've had a lot of failures in reading and sometimes years and years of that. So these are some areas that are related to getting back on track with that, but a really good intervention where students can see their progress, have some control and choice, where they're seeing the change that's happening, even if it's slower than what they might have in their mind needs to happen, tends to easily increase motivation. All right, and I'm just going to finish with a couple areas to leave you contemplating that are being researched further and need to be researched further, particularly with students with reading disabilities. And one is, we have actually quite a bit on oral language development, but we don't pay attention to all of it. And so the extent to which students are learning early how to inference just in their language, have a high vocabulary, of course, learning about different aspects of language well before they're thinking about print or integrated if they're older as you're doing the print. If you know how to inference on the playground, inferencing in a story about the playground is going to be a lot easier, right? And some of that is background knowledge as well. So oral language development is a key area that really needs to kind of be added as a component. We talk about the 5 components, and sometimes people will say oral language and vocabulary, but it largely tends to focus on vocabulary. Digital versus paper reading and a person's comprehension. When it comes to the disability world, we talk about digital in terms of the accommodations that are available. Oh, you can hear the story being read. You can, if you don't know what this word is, you can click on something that will tell that word. But there's some early research now really looking at, for all kids, all people, adults included, that your comprehension of digital material is almost always consistently lower than your comprehension of paper reading. And it may be that there is actually some different and more explicit instruction that we need to do on digital reading that has not been fleshed out yet, so I don't have the answers for you, but it's something to think about. You can't just put the paper thing in a digital form and think that they have the skills to comprehend that. And then one that's really big for our students with reading disabilities is building stamina in reading. And I know a lot of you, if you either are a teacher or have a child, being able to read and understand and monitor that comprehension for lengthy passages is something we actually probably have to teach. And a lot of times, because we do these manageable steps, we're trying to teach all these other things, and so they end up reading very short time periods, right? But in the world, we often have to read for much longer. And so building that stamina is an area we not only need to research, but think about. All right, so I'm gonna try and leave you with the joy of reading that we sometimes forget about when we're talking about intensive reading. This is my 5-year-old who is starting kindergarten next year, and he is just starting to think about words.
Is this one P?
Yep. What sound does I make? Good.
What's that one?
That's a G.
G. Pig! What?
All right, so never forget that reading can be joyful. All right, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed this presentation. There was like so many elements. There's moments where we have researchers come in and, when we think about kind of translation to the general public or understanding some of the base science stuff, we see some brain slides, some really cool, EEG or fMRI studies. And you're like, there's so much really cool work happening here, but I'm not quite sure exactly how I'm going to think about that in terms of the classroom that I've got to go back to on Tuesday. But what I love about this talk is that there's so many things that as an educator you can actually anchor in on and think about how I'm showing up in front of kids tomorrow, right? So I love that, and I so appreciate all that great work. We had some great conversations today. We at Windward, we spend a lot of time looking at our data, thinking about the work we do, thinking about the intentionality. And I'm going to pull up one of the slides I took a photo of here because I wanted to kind of really echo a little bit of this. When we do our work, we have really done such a great job, I think, of really kind of constructing a program that's really steeped in science and really brings a lot of those. And when we look at this idea of explicit instruction and really making sure that our kids are getting some really clear skill development pieces, this idea of bringing systematic instruction to the whole of it and think about that thoughtfulness and how we construct from start to finish in our program and all the linkages there. This idea of ample practice, I love that, and we do such great work here. But I think it's something that a lot of school programs miss out on the opportunity to really provide that structure in. And then the last one that I think is so important, and you touched on so many times, this idea of immediate feedback. And not just great job, well done, but really getting deep into that feedback, being so clear. So many things as educators I hope you're walking away with tonight, really with a sense of, some things that you can feel really empowered to do in the moment as you are setting in front of kids or really coaching other teachers. To think about in that work. So thank you so much for the great work you're doing in service of kids and reading all across this great country. So normally this is the part where we do a little Q&A. We have about 800 folks, between here and online. So I don't know how in the world we would manage that with that. So we're actually going to do something just a little bit differently here. We're going to say thank you to our folks at home, and we're going to end our live stream. And we're going to invite our folks who are in the audience tonight, our intrepid travelers who came out to brave what I think is actually pretty good weather here today. So it's not like you had to a rough drive through the rain, right? It was sunny out there, a little chilly, but I'm so glad you're here. But we're going to transition over, and we're going to try to do something a little different. We're going to do a little kind of happy hour reception-y thing where you're going to get have some refreshments, some libations, and then we're going to get a chance to ask some questions of our researcher friend here, Dr. Wanzek. So with that, I'm going to say a big thank you to everyone at home who tuned in. A big thank you to everybody who showed up here today. Again, we're so excited to be part of such a great and vibrant community that really celebrates and brings research to the forefront of what we do and really works to incorporate that those great learnings every single day in our classroom. So thank you all for being here. Thanks for our friends at home, and have a wonderful night. Big round of applause. Thank you.